sometimes you've got to very often sit in awe and complete disbelief at the fact of just how I'd call our government incompetent, but I think at this point it would almost be a praise of the government, because that's just how bad our government are, especially with the handling of the corona crisis. Not only that, but with Brexit on top of things. And you may very well think, I mean, it's weird. It's really weird to go back to the start of this year and watch some of my videos of just back then and just think, oh, but for those hazy days of when things might have been more calm. And I always said that we'd see things kick off, in March and April. But of course, that's when the coronavirus hit. So a lot of that stuff has been put off. But now we're seeing the internal market bill almost reignite these fires that many in the Conservative Party secretly hoped Boris Johnson would put to bed. Not only that, but his internal market bill also threatens the reputation of the United Kingdom for being someone who stood up for the rule of international law. That is the one thing around the world we are known for. But Boris Johnson has just said, whatever, I'm just going to, do what I want. And, we've seen the internal market bill. We don't know how watered down these with the amendments the internal market bill is going to be, but with the amendment we've already seen to quote quell the Tory rebellion, all it essentially does is to say, yeah, we're still going to break international law, but we're going to give the Parliament a vote on whether to not actually break international law. Which is just a ridiculous compromise to begin with, because as we saw today with that first passing of the bill, actual MPs, would vote to break international law. That should be a warning sign to all those, Conservative rebels and the people who, quote, abstained, who I basically said you should have just voted for it because that's how useful your abstention was. I simply say this. Nothing has changed. Johnson has just kicked the can down the road to another point where a minister will say that, oh yes, we need to renege on the withdrawal agreement for whatever reason. I'm sure they'll make one up. And oh yeah, I need to have a vote just to ensure that Parliament ensures that I can break international law. Johnson has a majority. And we have just seen that MPs are willing to break international law. But that's not what we're going to talk about today, because this article I found quite interesting, and it points to what I think it's what Patrick Colburton says is a deficiency in Boris Johnson's leadership, and that he's thinking more as a newspaper columnist, and that is a detriment to his PMship. So, 20 years ago, a novelist went to see his publisher to discuss a proposal to write a dystopian novel set in Britain in 2020, when the newspaper columnists have taken power and are running the country. These opinion makers, sometimes called the commentariat, have had for years been expressing outrage at the failings of the government and everyone else. Now they had a chance to show what they could do and put things right. The novelist would have probably mentioned the name Boris Johnson, with this fluoride dictations of the EU tyranny on Michael Gove and his historic hostility to the Good Friday Agreement as a surrender to the IRA. But these were the kind of people he was talking about. The book will be a dark comedy as we see these self-confident pundits crash into reality, explained the novelist. Of course, to make the narrative more exciting, I will have to dream up some sort of existential crisis menacing Britain so that they will respond with serial incompetence. It will be as if Peter Sellers' Inspector Clouseau had blundered into the dystopian world of Orwell's 1984. I'm not going to lie, I sort of want to track this book down and read it now. The publisher cautiously replied that there was always a market for books predicting future calamities, but to be convincing, it would have to reflect or satirize some feasible vision of the future. As for those irritating columnists, aren't you taking them a bit too seriously, he asked? After all, Fogies, a young man, have always been with us, claiming that the country is going to the dogs and pointing the finger of blame at Brussels, immigrants, or the Labour Party. Remember Enoch Powell and his rivers of blood. It was a precedent, he added, a moment when most readers might feel that the nasty type of change seen in the 20th century had come to an end. Look at how well a mildly reformist Tony Blair and his new Labour Party were doing, he concluded. The novelist sensed that his big idea was not going down well, as he had hoped, and suggested broadening the theme of the book by imagining a government run by former journalists and PR specialists, all expert in dominating news headlines. But they would suffer from the chronic weakness of their trades, which is to confuse words with deeds. Think in terms of short-term headlines and not long-term policies, and blame others when anything went wrong. But this wasn't a wrapped-up version of the old jibe against politicians that they'd never actually run anything before taking office, objected the publisher. Yes, you're right, replied the novelist, but politicians with a background in newspaper punditry are the worst of all, because they have become too used to expressing single-minded views on complex problems which they naturally know too little about. They confidently say what should have been done one week and say the exact opposite in the next, in the correct belief that few of their readers will notice the U-turns. He went on to say that the commentariat tends to be ignorant of the mechanisms of government, and they will and were they ever to gain power, would be baffled when they pulled the lever or pressed a button and nothing much happens. The novelist could have gone on about the weakness of journalists in power, but he saw it was a lost cause, and his book synopsis was heading for the wastepaper basket. He thought briefly before dismissing the idea of making a last-minute offer to shift the novel's action from Britain to America, and talk about the growing malign influence of the commentators on Fox News and elsewhere. In later years, the publisher did not regret turning down the book, but he did feel that after 9/11 and Afghan and Iraq and the Libyan wars and the financial crash of 2008, that a disastrous future was becoming more imaginable. Liberal democracies espousing free market capitalists had once seemed to be the wave of the future, weathering the atrocities and becoming stronger and more brutal. A right-wing populist nationalist regimes popped up everywhere. Brexit in 2016 was Britain's contribution to this trend, which would certainly not have happened without the right-wing press dripping poison into its readers' minds about immigration and the EU as a source of their troubles. Yet, demagogic influence by the media in Britain is not exactly a new phenomenon. It was, after all, almost a century ago that the Conservative Party leader, Stanley Baldwin, made his devastating attack on newspaper proprietors for wanting power without responsibility, the prerogative of the harlot throughout the age. It was obvious from the beginning that Boris Johnson's government ticked all the boxes for the imaginary novelist publisher in my fable, and that had discussed just 20 years earlier. Led by prominent members of the commentariat, they shared all his weaknesses and bask and dismissive of views of others and the constant periodic overdrive, with Britain always in being a world beater or potentially so. Such boosterism is harmless enough until it leads to serious miscalculation about how the balance of power between Britain and other nations, which is the case, disaster often quickly follows. None of this might have mattered much if Britain had not been on the verge of the worst crisis in its history since 1940 to 1941. This was not leaving the EU. Remainers said that Brexit would mean the ruin of the country. But then, as someone remarked, a country has a great deal of ruin in it. Brexit might not be quite the catastrophe that its opponents predicted, but the real moral danger turned out to be the Brexiteers themselves, with their chronic poor judgment and dismal organising skills, vainly trying to stem the unprecedented health, social and economic calamity. Johnson turns out to be the epitome of the commentariat, who, by training and experience, are particularly ill-equipped to deal with the coronavirus pandemic. He overpromises and underdelivers on everything, from world-beating test and trace systems to that has just seized up to the most proposed moonshot to test everyone in the country by Christmas. This is a terrifying sense of inexperienced amateurs at work, so that the government is repeatedly caught by surprise by predictable and wildly precedent events. The sight of Baroness Harding of Winscombe, in charge of the testing and tracing on which the fate of a nation supposedly depends, claiming that nobody she knew had foreseen such a surge in coronavirus, sends a completely chilling message about common sense and the competence of the Johnson government. As for Johnson himself, he would have been in his element writing columns about the current crisis. One week he would be demanding a total lockdown to suppress the virus, and the next he would be saying that it was time to open up the economy and establish herd immunity. On this and every other issue, he will be having his cake and eating it. Meanwhile, we are getting all too real idea of what a dystopian Britain would actually look like. And I have to say, what a book. I'd definitely read that. But it's completely true. We are now in this bizarre sense where we have people who, they used to be talking big games, oh, the government's failing us, they should be doing X, Y, and Z, and then another week saying completely else. But now they're in power. And as was clearly said there, they think they know about government, but when they're pulling the levers and pressing the buttons, nothing's happening. What we really need, and this is general, this is the current failure of the Tory party in their short-term thinking, is what we really need is a long-term strategy to this. But that long-term strategy would have to be a really well thought out policy. And then with that policy you could then bring it into Parliament and we could all vote for it. And no MP would vote against it. There might be a few. But it would sail through because it would have a clear set of objectives. This is how much money we need to spend. This is what we need to get done. These are the objectives we need to meet. But they don't want to do that because they're all about short-termism. And Johnson is a perfect example of this. He thinks he knows how government works. But as was said there, when he pulls the lever and expects stuff to be done, it doesn't get done because she needs someone to actually plan stuff out. And this just spells a huge problem, not only just for our current crisis, but for the country going forward for the next couple of years. Because if you think, if Johnson goes, it's very likely someone like Michael Gove will probably take over. And Gove is just exactly the same as Boris. Except, he doesn't have the fluffy hair. He's just got, a comically wide glasses. But other than that, that's about it. So, with that said, please do hit that like and share button and share this video around. It helps out the channel massively. Of course, if you are new as well, do hit that subscribe button. We do talk about Brexit and British politics a lot on this channel. Also, if you would like, there is a link down below to my Patreon page and a one-off donation link should you like to support the channel in that way. And also, I'd like to thank the people who have donated to me and are my patrons. Thank you very much. Your support is absolutely well and truly appreciated during this time. So, with that, thank you very much, and we'll see you all next time.